For my own part, I would as soon be descended from that heroic little monkey who braved his dreaded enemy in order to save the life of his keeper, or from that old baboon who, descending from the mountains, carried away in triumph his young comrade from a crowd of astonished dogs, as from a savage who delights to torture his enemies, offers up bloody sacrifices, practices infanticide without remorse, treats his wives like slaves, knows no decency, and is haunted by the grossest superstitions. Charles Darwin. Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 35. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today, I'm going to be looking at evolution. This is something we often examine on this podcast, and I'm going to specifically be looking at a pamphlet that I was handed by one of the members of my congregation last week, and he knows I often think about these kinds of topics, and he said, this might be something you're interested in. And so he had it in a plastic sheath. And so this thing looks like it's probably from the late 60s, early 70s. So we're talking about this pamphlet is over 50 years old. It is called Monkey Business. I have it right here beside me. A Refutation of the Theory of Evolution by Kenneth Green. And so Ken Green was a preacher in the North Alabama area back in the, I guess, 70s, 80s, maybe even more recent than that. I think he's passed away. But this brother had this pamphlet that he had put out back in the 60s or 70s, I guess, and he wanted to know what I thought about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it talks about in that pamphlet today. What's interesting is that it's 50 plus years old, and yet it's still pretty relevant. Some of the language is outdated, and some of the examples in it scientifically, we would say, these aren't this. It wouldn't be the things that we would lead with today in 2025. But the fundamental principles that are going against evolution are actually very useful. So I want to start by talking a little bit about Darwin, because I started this with a quote from Darwin that was describing his comparison to himself to monkeys, and really wanting to rather be descended from monkeys than the group of people that he would call savages. And we'll talk about what he's meaning there. But he's a polarizing figure. When you talk about Charles Darwin, you have people that love him and you have people that absolutely hate him. And one of the reasons why he is so polarizing is in part because of his book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. It is on the origin of species. So the book was about the idea of trying to talk about how species come to exist. Now, that is an inherently unscientific idea. You cannot scientifically prove one way or the other. You can't prove scientifically, from a scientific perspective, creation or evolution, by the way. I think we can use the word proof or prove by comparing the ideas of each to what we see in nature. That's not the same as a scientific proof, though. And so I want to be clear about that. I often talk about proving creation and disproving evolution. And generally what I mean by that is essentially showing how one is anti-scientific and the other is not. And so one of the things that, one of the subtitles, or not one of but the subtitle to Darwin's book is The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Okay? And that means what it means what it says, right? The idea here is the idea of favored races. He often speaks of savages in his writings, and so he certainly saw Aboriginal people. He certainly saw African people, people that he would call Negroes. Sometimes he used the hard ER in some of his correspondence I've seen. And so he didn't think highly of some of these groups, and his evolutionary perspective makes it clear why you wouldn't think highly of these people. One of the things we're going to talk about later on today is that if all humans are descended from lower forms, then that means that some are, again, more enlightened, some are higher races, and some are favored races, as he calls it in the subtitle to his book. But that necessarily means that there are lower races. There are races of people that are closer to the animals. Now, according to the Bible, there's one race. Everyone comes from one blood. There isn't this idea of favored races. But according to Darwin, according to many racist groups that have used Darwin's theories, no, there are favored races. And those, for example, white supremacist groups would certainly point to Darwin's ideas and writings to go along with that. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. That's not going to really be the. I'm going to be looking more at the science of this, but I will eventually do a podcast and talk about the racism of evolution because it is something that I was reading something today, and basically atheists and evolutionists, they'll get in these forums and they again lament how the religious people just don't understand Darwin and all of that kind of thing, and they just don't read him closely enough, and that kind of idea. And it's not that people don't read him closely that are calling him racist. It's because he actually has things that are problematic, and what they want to do is try to justify him somehow. So I will say this about Darwin, and I like to point this out because there are people that are believers that essentially think that Darwin had no contribution to science. Now, I'm not going to say that. I will say that his contributions are highly exaggerated in the sense that people act like one, that the idea was completely revolutionary. No one else was saying anything about natural selection, for instance, uh, which isn't the case. But the other piece to it is that again, what he was saying was not the things that are actually useful are not disputed by anyone today, but the things that aren't useful are the big issues. And so he extrapolated in ways that he could not have known that he was going to be wrong. And what's disappointing is that 150 plus years later, people haven't just discarded it completely, but we're beginning to see cracks in the foundation, and eventually it's going to break loose, and people are going to see this for what it is. I think again the atheistic undertones of it are what has allowed it to survive this long. But like we're going to be looking at this book that's 50 plus years old today, and we're going to see that it basically pokes holes in the entire paradigm in ways that we continue to do today. So, but here's the thing that Darwin got right. Darwin opposed the idea that was popular at that time that every species and variation had been independently created. So if there are 50 different types of dogs, God must have made each one of these types of species or variations independently. Now, the reason why many people went that direction is because as there was growing evidence for things like natural selection, it was tempting for people to try to oppose these conclusions that more atheistic types wanted to come to, which is the idea that, well, there was never a God that created different kinds of organisms, but this is all something that just could come about on its own. And often people wanting to avoid that conclusion would go to another extreme that was also wrong. So, no, God didn't create every single species and variation independently at the beginning, but instead, God has actually used genetics in organisms so that different kinds of animals and plant life can adjust and adapt to their circumstances. So, here's the thing about natural selection: God made that. So so the person who's a believer doesn't have to somehow look at natural selection and believe that, oh, well, that means I have to believe in evolution. No, natural selection is something that God made. The issue with the evolutionist is they take natural selection and they make it out to be a mechanism for unlimited variation, and that's not something we see anywhere in nature, and we're going to talk about that later on. Okay, so proponents of evolution often deify Darwin in a way that is unsettling for those of us who are believers, but not just unsettling, but it's insulting often. So if you've ever seen something like this, the so-called Jesus fish with feet on it, and then the name Darwin put on it, you can see where this is highly unsettling and disturbing and irritating, might I even say infuriating for a believer, because you take the Jesus fish, which is a symbol of Jesus Christ as the Son of God and Savior of the world, and you put Darwin's name on it and you put feet on it. So you not only want to poke fun at something that is a symbol of Jesus Christ, but you then take that same thing and put the name of Darwin on it, someone who would oppose Jesus Christ. So let me explain to you. Maybe you have no idea what this is referring to, but that fish symbol is a symbol that is again related to Jesus Christ, and basically the idea here is that the fish symbol was used in that centuries, really thousands of years ago, so during the time of the early church and moving forward, to denote someone was associated with Jesus. Now, you might say, why show a fish? Where there are a couple of things to think about. First of all, we know that one of the great miracles that Christ performed was to take five loaves of bread and two small fish and feed thousands of people with it. And so the idea of Christ being able to take the fish and multiply them, obviously he had disciples, later apostles, who were previously fishermen, and Christ told them, I will come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. So there is the fish symbolism that's throughout his ministry. But a deeper meaning there is that if you look at the Greek word for fish, that word is ichthus. And if you're spelling it out in Greek letters, you would use the letter iota, chi, theta, upsilon, and sigma. I'm trying to remember this off the top of my head. And I don't want you to just take my word for it. We're going to look it up on Google in a second, but it would be those five letters. So iota, chi, theta, upsilon, and sigma. You say, okay, Jerry, who cares about the Greek word for fish spelling out uh, having these five letters? Well, what's interesting is that it is an acronym actually for something else. So it's an acronym for the word Jesus, which is Jesus. So that I, the iota, is stands for Jesus. The chi stands for Christos, which is Christ. The theta stands for Theos, which is God. The upsilon stands for Huios, which is Son. And the sigma stands for Soter, which is Savior. Okay, so if you put those five words together, you have the five Greek letters that stand for five Greek words that mean what? Jesus, Christ, God, Son, Savior. And so you have the simple fish that spells out these Greek that there's a Greek word ichthus, and that Greek word ichthus can be broken down into five Greek letters, and those five Greek letters stand for five words that are describing Jesus Christ being the Son of God and Savior. And you say, Jerry, you're just making that stuff up. So we're going to jump off of the slides really quick and just look this up. So if we look up Jesus fish and we just Google it, then you have, okay, it's the AI overview. If you don't trust that, you could go to the Wikipedia article, but the AI overview actually shows this. So it has this ichthus being derived from the Greek word ichthus, which is an acronym for Jesus, Christos, Theou, Huios, Soter, meaning Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Okay? So when you see that symbol, maybe it sometimes it will have this. You see the five letters that I just mentioned here: the iota, chi, theta, upsilon, and sigma. Right? Sometimes it will have that in there. Sometimes it won't have anything like that. It will just be the symbol itself. So if we looked up images, sometimes it'll just be a plain Jesus fish. Sometimes it'll have a cross on it. Sometimes it'll have those Greek letters. But that's what that stands for. And so the reason why I bring this up is that if you have these these proponents of evolution that want to troll Christianity while deifying Darwin, it's not it's it's a little irritating, and I want to think that people that do such a thing to this symbol just they don't know any better. They don't actually realize that that's what they're doing. If you do realize that, though, just don't be a troll. If you're an atheist, and don't be a troll where you take something that is like Darwin has nothing to do with Jesus Christ here. I mean, he actually does. Again, if you believe in Jesus Christ, if you believe in the Bible, it's going to tear down your evolutionary religion. It's going to tear down your atheism. So there's a sense in which I understand exactly why people would want to do it, but I want to believe that people actually are just simply not understanding what that means. So if you don't understand what that means, maybe you've got one of these on your car as a decal, just understand that you're being disrespectful when you do that. And if you want to keep doing that, then just understand that you're being a troll when you do that. And it would be, we would rather you not. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that Darwin basically points out that each species or each variation that we come across wasn't really independently created. And so one of the things he points out in his book on the origin of species, on the ordinary view of each species having been independently created, why should that part of the structure, which differs from the same part in other independently created species of the same genus, be more variable than those parts which are closely alike in the several species? I do not see that any explanation can be given. So the point he makes here is that it doesn't necessarily make sense that, again, you might have a bulldog and a Doberman Pinscher. They're both these canines that are pretty closely aligned, pretty closely alike. There are a lot of physiological differences, but the idea that God would have had to have created both variations of canines is not necessary. And so this is something he pointed out in his writing. And again, I don't think that he was necessarily advocating for God here, but he was saying that that isn't an idea that is necessary. And of course, he's right. When we look at all of the different species of domesticated dog today, if you were to look at all of those different ones, some of them are very different. And so if you look at a Yorkie, or I don't know all the different types of dogs, but there are these really big dogs like a Great Dane, and you compare that to some kind of poodle, those things look completely different. And if you just looked at their bones, which we'll talk about fossils later, if you just looked at their bones, you'd think they were completely a different type of animal, even though they're both domesticated canines. And this gets back to some of the problems with fossils. That if you were to look at all of the different types, different variations of domesticated dogs today, and you just only looked at them as fossils, you'd have no way of seeing that they were actually all the same kind of animal. You couldn't see that from the fossils. So putting a great deal of stock in how people interpret fossils today, when you know that that is the kind of error that would arise, seems problematic. Okay, so let's go back to the quote that we had at the very beginning. One of the only reason why I want to bring up this quote before we get into Ken Green's pamphlet and kind of go through the different parts of that is that when I look at this quote, it seems clear to me that Darwin essentially is saying, I'd rather be descended from a monkey or a baboon than to be descended from a savage. Now, what does he mean by a savage? Well, as we've already pointed out, what he generally meant by a savage was somebody that was not like the enlightened European, not like the Caucasian. What he thought was a savage were those Aboriginal peoples and maybe various groups that he saw in Africa. So people like to point out that he was against slavery and stuff like that. And look, if he was against slavery, good for him. It doesn't dismiss these concepts of savages that he talks about here. And what I've seen atheists try to do is say, well, he he didn't understand the difference between culture and nature. And he, again, conflated the two and thought that the savages were actually just naturally less enlightened, let's say, than the Caucasians, rather than just they had a different type of culture. And again, that's being very generous to him. And I can understand why you would want to be generous to him if you were more of an atheistic or evolutionist type. But it's still something that you see here where he seems to be siding with the monkey, the baboon, not the human. And that's a really interesting thing for him to say. And it really gives us some insight into how he must have thought about things. So I just want to bring that up and point out that this is often the case, that people will often say something like, hey, I'd rather be from that monkey, or I'd rather be from that baboon, because the thing that these savages do, or the things that sometimes people do, I just would rather not be from that. So I just want to point that out, that a lot of what we're talking about here has very little to do with science, and it has much more to do with what people want. People want it to be that they are descended from these animals, rather than saying, okay, what actually happened. And as we've pointed out repeatedly, you aren't descended from monkeys or baboons. Uh, God made humans, and God made apes and primates of various kinds. But what he didn't do was make one single organism that gave rise to all of the different organisms that we see on the earth. That is a religious idea. We often call it evolution, but it's not something that holds up when you look at the science. Okay. So, because of these kinds of statements from Darwin, opponents of evolution will often want to point out this idea of wanting to of the evolutionists wanting us to come from monkeys. And we on the those of us who are opponents of evolution, and maybe even those who are proponents of evolution, kind of don't like that idea of we came from monkeys, or we came from these lower forms of these apes. But that's the natural outgrowth of this idea. And you'll notice I'll call it an idea, I'll call it a hypothesis. I don't care to call it a theory, because it doesn't hold up. I want to quickly, there is a definition of theory that you could potentially apply to evolution. But really quickly, let me show you. If we look up the word theory and we want to define it, in this case, I don't necessarily want to look at the AI overview. We could look at that, but I'd rather go directly to a dictionary. So, according to this appears to be the Oxford Language Dictionary. A theory is a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained. Darwin's theory of evolution. So, literally, the first definition given is what's applied to Darwin's theory. So, let's think about that for a second. A supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained. So, it says next that what's similar to this is the word hypothesis, the word thesis, the word conjecture. It mentions the word supposition within the definition. It also uses the synonym speculation. And what I would say is that all of these are similar ideas, to what we're talking about here. The problem is that there are, you might be looking at the Wikipedia definition right next to it. I want to point out that it's something from a science perspective. That idea is not what a theory is. And so the issue that we have here is that people use the popular definition of theory, applying it to evolution. But often, when scientists want to describe evolution and they want to call it a theory, they are using a more scientific definition. So I want to show you that one, and I want to explain that that's not what a theory is, or that's not what evolution is. It is not a theory in that sense. So if we look at theories in science, here in Wikipedia, it simply says that a theory is a systematic and rational form of abstract thinking about a phenomenon or the conclusions derived from such thinking. It involves contemplative and logical reasoning. So this gets back to something that's really more like that initial definition we saw. In the second paragraph, though, it says, in modern science, the term theory refers to scientific theories, a well-confirmed type of explanation of nature, made in a way consistent with the scientific method and fulfilling the criteria required by modern science. Such theories are described in such a way that scientific tests should be able to provide empirical support for it or empirical contradiction of it. And so this is a much better idea here. So we'll keep reading for a second because this is important. A scientific theory is something that can be falsified, meaning that we can empirically take a look at it and falsify it. Now, the beauty and the tragedy, let's say, of calling evolution a theory is that it's not a falsifiable idea. And the reason why it's not falsifiable is that the very evidence that would be needed to falsify it cannot occur. You say, Jerry, what do you mean you can't find something to falsify evolution? Well, if you think about it, when people talk about evolution, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and Jordan Peterson was talking about about evolutionary timescales. And this is what people often do. He talked about evolution a lot, and it makes my eyes roll around, and because he's such a smart person, and but he subscribes so fully to the evolutionary paradigm, and it has so many shortcomings and so many problems with it. But what happens when you speak on these evolutionary timescales? What you mean is you have to speak in the order of hundreds of thousands or millions of years, right? And then what happens is people will speak in these terms, and then they'll ascribe design to these evolutionary timescales, meaning that given enough time, you have these outcomes that in any other instance you would just call design. But in this case, you say, well, because this much time has elapsed, then these kinds of behaviors, these kinds of attributes of the organism come about over time, and it makes sense that it would be that way. In his case, he was talking specifically about how it made sense that something like autophagy, which is where the body basically eats away at its own cells, and it begins with the cells that are damaged. He basically said, well, it would make sense that autophagy would begin with damaged cells, because if it began with cells that weren't, then you'd be dead. But again, that's begging the question. You're beginning with the idea that you think that evolution brought this about, rather than saying, well, I could just as easily look at autophagy and say, well, it would make sense that God would design it this way. Because that's exactly what happened, right? Like it makes sense that God would design a process where the body eats away at its damaged cells first. But instead, what people will say is they will ascribe this design attribute to evolution and say, well, it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that autophagy would begin with damaged cells, because if it didn't happen that way, you would die. But again, what you're doing is you're begging the question here. You're saying, oh, okay, it would make sense that this random process of evolution would come up with mutations, and natural selection would select for autophagy to happen to damaged cells first, and that would be solidified over time, right? So there's no evidence that such a thing ever happened. What you do is you you say that it happened, and then you put the evolutionary language on it. So the thing with evolution is, because we're talking about such long time scales, you can't falsify it, right? There's no experiment to show that one kind of thing doesn't turn into another, because all the evolutionist is going to tell you is that, oh, well, there just hasn't been enough time for it to change into a different kind of thing. So everything that we observe is one kind of organism produces the same kind of organism. If you have a bacterium, it produces bacterium. If you have a human, it produces a human. If you have a dog, it produces a dog. If you have a if you have a stalk of corn, it produces corn. The corn doesn't produce apples. Apples don't produce apple seeds don't produce oranges. Rose seeds, I guess that's what you do. You plant rose seeds. Rose seeds don't give rise to whales or dolphins or duck-billed platypuses or whatever the plural of that is. So you understand what I'm saying. And so the issue here is that when someone points this out, and when you ask, I was watching a video about this, when you ask someone point blank, okay, show me an example of one kind of thing giving rise to another. You can't do it. And there was someone that was basically going around there was a college campus, and they went to the biology professors and they say, show me one example. And they said, I can show you plenty of examples. Okay. And the person said, okay, well, show me one then. And of course they couldn't, because you can't show one. You can claim that one happened, and you can claim that everything came about that way. But there's nothing empirical that you can point to. And because there's nothing empirical that you can point to, what's really insidious about this thing is that you can't falsify it, which is partly why it's been so easy, or why it's been able to endure for so long, is that you can't falsify it. So it really is more in the category of a hypothesis, but it's not even a great hypothesis. So, and it morphs and it changes when people point out things that are anti-scientific about it. People will try to shift it and go in a different direction. So I want to show you this next part, though. It says scientific theories are the most reliable, rigorous, and comprehensive form of scientific knowledge, in contrast to more common uses of the word theory that implies something is unproven or speculative, which in formal terms is better characterized by the word hypothesis. This is exactly correct. And what they're doing here is they're saying that true scientific theories are a form of scientific knowledge, and I agree. The issue is that people conflate evolution as being that first kind of theory, and it's not. It's much more like that second type of theory, which is a hypothesis. It is something that is unproven. It is something that is speculative. In formal terms, you would be better off calling it a hypothesis. Now, this is what we're talking about here when we talk about evolution. And this is why it's so important for us to point this out, because you have people conflating the two and then claiming that it's science. It's a scientific theory. No, at best, it's a hypothesis, and it's not a very good one at that. And what we're going to show in the remainder of our time today is why that's the case. So this book, Monkey Business, again, written by a preacher, actually, and which is interesting. So somebody like me, I have a PhD in mechanical engineering. Ken Green was a preacher, but he basically did his research. He tried to compile some things together, and I think this was originally written kind of to help young people be able to answer maybe some of the questions that they might have come across in some science classes that they were in. And so it basically has 7 chapters, then there was a conclusion. And the 7 chapters, just starting with the first one, is 5 Facts to Remember. Chapter 2, The Universe. Chapter 3, Living Organisms Which Witness Against Evolution. Chapter 4, What is Man? Chapter 5, Evolutionary Props Removed. Chapter 6, The Theory of Evolution is Unscientific. And Chapter 7, Fruits of Evolution. As I said, I would probably say 90+% of this is spot on. I think there are some places where the science is a little outdated in it. I'm not going to necessarily go page by page over this. It's about a 28 to 30 page pamphlet. But what we're going to do is we're going to hit the highlights of these 7 chapters and really just point out something that, again, people could see 50 years ago. That, again, these questions that Ken Green had 50 years ago are still unanswered. And there's a reason for that. And I think there's a growing mistrust of the scientific establishment because of things like this. After coming out of COVID, there's a great deal of mistrust of the scientific establishment because you saw people saying things in the name of science that weren't science. And so one of the things in that podcast I was watching the other day was the idea of the food pyramid and how the food pyramid is not scientific at all. And when you hear something like that and you observe that that's exactly the case, then one of the things it ought to make you do is say, what other things are there that are spoken of as if they are scientific theory or fact that aren't? And I'll give you the answer to that. One of the biggest ones is this so-called theory of evolution. It's a hypothesis at best and not a very good one. So let's talk about the what Ken Green talked about in chapter 1, 5 facts to remember. So what are these 5 facts? The first one is that evolution is not a fact. Now, we've already talked a little bit about this, but it's important to remember that what we're talking about here is a hypothesis. And if you go and read the guys that know the most about this, they're going to be the ones that are the most candid about this. Now, again, in the popular language, they might not say this, but when you read the technical literature, you're going to see people that aren't using terms like fact and theory to describe evolutionary hypotheses. They're just not going to do it. And in fact, specifically the neo-Darwinian synthesis, this idea of mutations with natural selection being basically being the engine for the changes that are needed. This idea is falling on hard times right now, and I'm eager to see it eventually be discarded completely. What the things that Darwin was initially saying, once we knew more about genetics, it became clear that you had to really change your thinking, and so they came to this neo-Darwinian way of looking at it, and now even that is falling onto hard times. So evolution is not a fact. The second thing is that evolution is a matter of faith. Now, this gets back to the hypothesis aspect of this, the fact that it is not falsifiable. See, this is the maddening part about it. It's difficult because it would be really great to have something that we can nail it down and say, okay, if evolution were true, let's do this experiment. But that's just it. All they're going to tell you when let's say you take some bacteria and you're going to create more and more bacteria, and you're going to have thousands upon thousands of different generations of bacteria, and there's still going to be bacteria. And if you point to that and say, hey, it didn't change, it's still bacteria. Now they'll say, well, it did change, and eventually it could change into a different kind. That's what they can always say. They can always say, well, with many, many, many more years, many, many, many more generations of bacteria, eventually you get to a thing that's not bacteria anymore. But again, that's a faith statement. That's not a statement from science. And this is exactly what we're talking about. It's a matter of faith. It's not a matter of fact. Okay. Third, all scientists are not evolutionists. One of the things I like to point out, again, I'm a man of science, have multiple degrees in engineering. And what I like to point out is that that's real science, right? That's applied science. There's a lot of this theoretical science out here where people can just make up stuff and it doesn't have to work. But in engineering, we're looking for stuff that works. And specifically when we talk about design, and we're going to talk about that, and I think the fifth fact has to do with design. If you're going to have somebody tell you whether something is designed or not, you don't listen to the biologist. Richard Dawkins is not the person to ask about design because he doesn't design anything. Ask the engineer. Ask the engineer what design looks like, and the engineer can tell you. But what happens is you have a bunch of biologists out here, a bunch of astrophysicists out here that are telling you that things aren't designed. They don't design things. So how would they know? What design principles are they going to tell you about? They're not going to be able to tell you. And so all scientists, and I would say again, applied science like engineering, I see plenty of scientists and engineers who are not evolutionists. And so this idea that all of the scientists or all of the reputable scientists are evolutionists is just not true. Fourth, there had to be a first cause. What he's getting at here is that people will ask the question, well, who made God or who created God? And again, the idea of who created God is one of those questions that reveals that you haven't really thought this thing through philosophically, that there has to be a first cause. And if you say that the Big Bang was the first cause, the issue there is that even the guys that talk about Big Bang, they want to describe this thing that's a singularity, which is basically the thing before the Big Bang. And then when you ask for information about that, they don't really know what to say there, where you have something that basically doesn't is not really matter, but it explodes into all the matter that currently exists. There had to be a first cause. If you want to say it's the singularity, okay, we're saying that there is a God, uh, an eternal, all powerful, all knowing designer of the universe. If you want to say that it's a singularity that exploded everything into existence from a state of chaos into a state of order, that's a matter of faith, but it doesn't line up with what we see in nature and in science. Okay, design demands a designer. One of the most compelling ideas to me is this, but that's because I'm trained. My training is in engineering design. So you have to design things. You have to design things to work. And what we see in nature and in the world is that things work. And what I can tell you from an engineering perspective is that things don't work haphazardly. Things don't work because of random processes. Things work because someone makes them work. When you look at a system that works, if you look at an app that does well, if you look at a website that you really like, if you look at a pair of shoes that fit you well and that are comfortable, someone spent time devising the idea before that thing was ever created and made for you to enjoy. And when it works, it's because someone put thought and work behind it. Now, many of the things that we design in the world as engineers, we actually are inspired by what we see in biology, by what we see in the world. Now, imagine this. We look at the human heart, and it is a marvel of mechanical engineering as a pump. And let's say I try to create a heart pump or a pump like the heart. It's not anywhere near that level of efficiency, of that level of effectiveness, but I make mine. No one disputes that mine is designed, but there is this group of people out here that will tell you that the one in your chest, that's far more efficient, far more effective, far more amazing, that it wasn't designed. And this is something that, again, from a philosophical perspective, doesn't make sense to me, but this is what people try to do. If there is design, there must have been a designer. And it's not enough to try to say, well, there was an evolutionary time scale, and over time, there was a thing that didn't really have a heart, and then it did have a heart, and it over time came to be this really great and efficient and effective device in your body. That doesn't work. If you have more time, that is more opportunity for it to not work well. That's more opportunity. If you're saying that mutations did this, there's more opportunity for it to settle on a really bad design, not create some good design. So the idea that you see a design and aren't looking for the designer doesn't make sense. Now that brings us to chapter 2. But before we get to chapter 2, let me give you a little scripture here. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4. For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. And so the idea here is really getting back to some of the facts that we saw here. There had to be a first cause, and there's a designer that made the things that we see. Every house is built by someone. We all observe that. And so when we look at this house that we live in, the earth, and we see how it's fitted for human life, the universe that we're in, which we're going to look at next, somebody built that to be conducive for human life. The one who built all things, not just the universe, but the one who built all things is God. Okay, little story time. There were a few things there in the chapter on the universe. The one that was most compelling to me was a story that was related about to Benjamin Franklin. So I'm going to tell that story really quickly. I'm going to read through it, and then we'll keep going. It is related that Benjamin Franklin, while sojourning in Paris one day, became engaged in argument with a famous French atheist. They agreed that on a certain day the atheist should come to Franklin's study, and they discussed their differences until one or the other of them was convinced. Before the time set, Franklin got ready for him. He had a little mechanical contraption built that would actually work. It was a very crude, elementary, miniature planetarium. It showed in the most primitive and rudimentary fashion how the planets revolved around the sun and their relations to one another. When the Frenchman knocked on the door, Franklin opened and admitted him to the room where his contraption was. "What on earth is that? And who made it?" asked the atheist. "That contraption is a crude planetarium, and nobody made it," replied Franklin. "It just happened." "Do you think I'm a fool?" asked the atheist. "Well," Franklin said, "you have told me over and over that the solar system had no creator, that it just happened. This machine is a most crude and primitive contrivance, attempting to duplicate on a small scale some of the bodies of that system and their movements. Do you think I'm a fool to say that the mighty solar system had no maker?" Obviously, what Franklin is appealing to in this story is design. He's saying, look, if we look at the solar system and we want to say that it's not designed, but then we look at a model of the solar system and we say, well, of course that's designed. In fact, the atheist says, do you take me for a fool to tell me that contraption right there wasn't designed? Well, this is precisely what people are being taken as. You're taking me for a fool to look at the universe in all of its intricate detail and how effective these orbits of these planets are, and how specifically the Earth within that universe is this little area that is conducive for human life. Psalm 19, verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no. Psalm 14, verse 1. Excuse me. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. I just want to say here that, again, it's not to say that a person is stupid when the scripture says that they are a fool. But again, the idea of foolishness is someone who doesn't understand the truth. And so being a fool in that case is not to say that, again, you're stupid. It's much more to say you're devoid of understanding. It's more of being ignorant than it is about being having a low IQ or something. And this is the issue. There are very high IQ people who are fools in the sense that they are ignorant, and again, don't want to understand the truth. And that's part of what we try to help people with on this podcast. Okay. Chapter 3 was about organisms that witness against evolution. And so the first couple are spiders and ants, and they operate by instinct. And we see really so many animals and insects and spiders in nature that operate by instinct. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, this has always been an interesting question for me. Okay, what happened prior to the spider having the instinct to do the things it needs to do? These things that it needs to do are crucial to its survival. So what happened prior to the instinct? Same thing with the ants. You see ants that operate by instinct, and there is a scripture that refers to some of that instinct. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise, which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. When you study ants, you see just a marvel of organization, and yet you don't see a captain or an overseer or a ruler, but ants just know what to do. And if they don't do what they need to do, which is what Solomon points out here, if the ant isn't gathering what it needs to and doing what it needs to at the various times of the year, it's not going to go well. When you look at spiders, which are a little bit more creepy to us, I think, when you look at a spider web, how does it do that? You have the Marvel superhero Spider-Man, who shoots these webs out and is able to use them to move around. And you look at something like that, and you certainly don't look at that and look at what Spider-Man does and say, oh, well, that just kind of happens that way. No, you understand that there's more to it than that. The thing that's always interesting to me about instinct in spiders and ants is, again, well, what happens when that instinct isn't there, because apparently it's not, and it just somehow comes about over time. It makes far more sense when you see something literally that's programmed to do what it does, which is what ants are. Ants are programmed. That instinct is internal programming. Those spiders do what they do by internal programming. And so you can't show me this is gets back to the falsifiability of the evolutionary hypothesis. Show me the spider that doesn't have the ability to shoot webs or to create webs and engineer them. Because again, it's also an engineering marvel when you look at a spider web. Show me the spider that needs the web for survival, that didn't have the web and what it would whatever it was doing then, and then somehow it it generated the ability to do it, and then instinctually all later spiders do it. Again, what is the evolutionary mechanism for such a thing? There isn't one. And so you just have to believe it. You just have to say, well, yeah, I can't explain it, but that's just how it happened. And so there are plenty of us that are now saying, no, that's not how it happened. And again, as someone who writes computer code, when you see something that's programmed, you don't look at a program and say, okay, well, yeah, that just kind of came about haphazardly over time. No, that thing is designed, and design does not come about haphazardly over time. There are a couple of other things we could take a look at. You look at the pollination of bees. Think about this. Which came first? A bee that pollinates flowers, or the flower being food for the bee? Because the issue there is, if there aren't any bees to pollinate the flowers, then there aren't going to be any flowers for the bees to have for food. And so, which one comes first? From an evolutionary perspective, you don't really have an answer for that. And you might say, well, you have all of these plants that don't necessarily need bees. But again, the bees aren't necessarily using those for food. So it's these kinds of questions where you have something in place, where there is a system in which one thing needs the other, and the other thing needs the original thing. And so you can't have one without the other. But there's no evolutionary mechanism for co-evolving these two things that somehow need each other, because there had to have been a point at which one didn't need the other. But there's no answers to this, and again, there's no falsifiability. Because I'd love to just point that out and say, okay, therefore evolution can't be true. I can't exactly do that, but what I can do is say that's a really big problem that the creation perspective doesn't have. You think about birds like the woodpecker that have this specialized hardware to do what they do. And you ask yourself, okay, how do you evolve something like that? Because once you have this finished product that is very effective in what it does, there would have, from an evolutionary perspective, there would have needed to be all of these suboptimal birds that lead up to the final woodpecker. But the problem is all of those suboptimal birds would not have been preserved via natural selection, because it wouldn't have made any sense to preserve them, because they would have been so far removed from what they would have needed to survive in the environment. So this is one of the big problems with evolution, is the idea that if you say that it came about, that again, let's talk specifically about natural selection, because natural selection is not the same as evolution. But if you say that natural selection has produced all of these things, the problem with natural selection is all it does is it can help an existing organism adapt itself within the current environment. What it doesn't do is create things. All it does is really change some of the attributes of a population of organisms, but it doesn't create new things, right? All of the genetic information is there. And natural selection, and if you want to talk about mutations make some changes in the sense that you might have genetic information being lost, but you don't create new genetic information. And I know that people will say, well, sometimes when you're copying things, sometimes it'll get copied and it'll be somewhat different. Yes, but you're not creating new genetic information. That's not how it works. That's not how mutations work. And so you're not creating anything new. If anything, you're breaking existing code in a way that might give you some benefit, um, but ultimately is not creating a new thing. It's just giving you some benefit. So the example here is people talk about. I believe one of the examples has to do with something like sickle cell anemia, right? That if you have sickle cell anemia, I believe that makes you less prone to have malaria. Now, if you think about that for a second, again, let's look it up because I could just imagine someone saying, "No, that's not true." Uh, Sickle cell anemia and malaria. Okay, so sickle cell anemia and malaria are both diseases that affect red blood cells. They have different causes and different effects, and individuals with sickle cell anemia are more susceptible to malaria infection compared to those without the disease. And this is because the sickle cell red blood cells are more vulnerable to the malaria parasite. However, interestingly, individuals who carry the sickle cell trait are partially protected against malaria. This is because the presence of the trait makes it more difficult for the malaria parasite to infect and multiply in the red blood cells. Now, here's the problem with these AI overviews. That literally just contradicted itself. So I think the idea here, well, let me take that back. It's not a contradiction. What it's saying, the first part says that if you get malaria as sickle cell, if you were sickle cell, if you have sickle cell anemia and you get malaria, you're more susceptible. But if you have sickle cell, you're less likely to get malaria because it's more difficult for the malaria parasite to infect and multiply in the red blood cells. So it's not a contradiction. It's just a subtle difference. So it's saying here, if you have sickle cell, if you get malaria, you're more likely to die, let's say, or more likely to have really bad complications. But the issue is that if you have sickle cell, you're actually less likely to get malaria than someone who doesn't have sickle cell because it's harder for the malaria parasite to infect. My point is this: people will point to something like that and they'll say, hey, um, according to that, having sickle cell makes you um, less likely to get malaria. And so, therefore, that's an improvement of some kind. Sickle cell anemia is still a genetic disorder. And if there is some side benefit that comes to it, that's still not something that you look and say there's some kind of evolutionary improvement. And this is the kind of thing that people say. People act like mutations are this good thing, and like in that case of sickle cell anemia, where well you're less likely to get malaria, so that's a benefit to it. Now again, we like to point out that the only place you see mutations making superhuman humans is X-Men. It's in the Marvel movies. That's where you find that kind of stuff. You don't find it in nature. If someone has a mutation, that is generally a bad thing. And for the most part, it's either going to be something that is maybe neutral where you don't know about it, or it's not good. It's not going to be something where all of these mutations over time are helping us as a human race, for instance. Okay, there are carnivorous plants like the Venus flytrap. There are sea mammals like whales and dolphins. All of these are witnesses against evolution because you look at them and say, okay, tell me from an evolutionary perspective how this works. And there aren't any good answers to this. And one of the things we point out is that even if you take the idea of calling it theory of evolution, what you mean is that more hypothesis idea. A hypothesis is supposed to help you explain things. Evolution doesn't help you explain any of this. All it does is it's a thing where people like to mention it, but it's not really getting to anything that helps you explain things better. Okay, I want to talk about humans for a second, but there's a scripture in Psalm 8, verses 3 through 6. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. So when you think about mankind, humans are clearly different than everything else. And one of the things I like to point to is that the human body is a system of systems. Um, all of these organisms that we've mentioned, all of these animals, when you look at spiders and birds and bees and carnivorous plants and these sea mammals, they're all systems of systems themselves. Now, from an engineering perspective, what is a system of systems? It is where you have these interconnected systems that work together as a whole. So we have the skeletal system, your bones. We have the circulatory system, where it's your blood. And you have something like your skin, which is kind of a system of itself. You look at something like the nervous system. So you have all of these different systems that all work together to form the human body. And these systems communicate amongst themselves and they work together to do the things that the human body does. Now, from an engineering perspective, a system of systems has to be designed if it's going to work well at all. And of course, you can't look at the human body and not marvel at it from an engineering perspective. I work with humanoid robots, so we're working on a humanoid robot, and I can tell you from experience, it's really tough to do some of the very simple things that we are able to do. One of the things we're doing in our lab is we're working on a hand, and we're going to be doing some manipulation type stuff soon, where you want the hand to be able to pick up things. That's really tough, and our hand, we like it, we think it's pretty cool, but I'll tell you, compared to the human hand, it's not even close. And so the human body is a system of systems, and it was clearly designed. And I'm saying this from a perspective of a mechanical engineer. And so the human body is a system of systems. Let's talk about some of the systems. If you think about your visual system, which one would you rather have, a camera or the human eye? If we could duplicate in a physical device what the human eye can do, it would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more. If you think about the human neural network versus some other communication system that we might find in the world, the human neural network is amazing. The brain is basically a 3 pound, I don't want to call it a supercomputer because that's probably not doing it justice. The way people 200 years ago thought of the brain, they probably would have called it a counting machine or something, and that wasn't doing it justice. To call it a supercomputer doesn't do it justice. Whatever it is, when you think about the energy requirements that it has, when you think about again how lightweight it is, and just all of the different things that it does, the way it's able to adapt, the way you can again take parts out of it and it still works, it's amazing. And that's just the brain, and that's not even talking about the rest of the human nervous system. You think about the human ear versus a microphone. Microphones are really cool. That technology has gotten much better over years. The human ear is still more amazing. And again, we talked about the human brain versus a computer. Obviously, human brains is really beyond a supercomputer. So if we think about the intelligence and reason of humans, if we think about how we can appreciate beauty and how we're able to create things, the way we're able to adapt in ways that other organisms are not, and our spiritual nature, these are all things that God put in us that make us different than the animals. And this isn't something that just somehow arose over time, over random processes. There's a reason why we are different than the animals. It is because God made us that way. We are made in the image and likeness of God, according to Genesis chapter 1. Okay, here's some evolutionary props removed. Similarity proves relationship or common ancestry. So often what people will point out is they'll look at, let's say, something like DNA. And they'll say, hey, this organism has DNA and this organism has DNA. Similarity proves relationship. Similarity proves that we must have had a common ancestor. This is one of the most. This is one of those false ideas that gets thrown around a lot. That, oh well, this is the same in chimps as it is in humans. Common ancestry, false. Common designer, true. Again, all of that in all of those kinds of so-called pieces of evidence for evolution can be pointed to as actual evidence for a common designer, as someone again who writes computer code, who has designed things. We reuse things that work, and of course, the designer of the world could use similar designs in different parts of his creation. That just I often see people try to come make this idea work, and they completely are maybe oblivious to the fact that a common designer would absolutely do this. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's false. That would be one I would let you look up, but it's essentially the idea that if you look at the development of an embryo, that it is the same as the development over time evolutionarily, and we now know that to be false. And some of this is still potentially in biology textbooks to this day, and we know this is false, which is irritating, if not again infuriating. Mutations in natural selection are the creative force behind evolution. False. Mutations don't create anything. Natural selection doesn't create anything. You're selecting for existing genetics. You're not creating anything. The fossil record is filled with evidence of evolution. False. And one of the things I've on this channel, when I was answering comments all the time, I had somebody one time give me this long list of missing links. And all I did is start with the first one. I looked at the first one, looked it up. It wasn't a missing link. And I pointed this out and said, and what the person did was say, well, you can't just throw out this one and then not look at the rest of them. I was like, oh, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm not going to look at this list that you copied out of Wikipedia somewhere and that you don't even know what's all on that list. And you try to tell me that all of those things are missing links. They're not missing links. And so this idea of the fossil record being filled with evidence of evolution, we just talked about before, that we could go right now and we could find, we could, not, let's not say kill the dogs, but let's say we could take dead dogs of various kinds, from the tiniest toy poodle that you could find to the biggest Doberman or Great Dane or whatever the biggest dog is. And if you took the fossil remains of all of those different dogs, you could easily say, oh, well, this one gave rise to this one, and this one gave rise to this one, and this one gave rise to this one. And you know what would happen? It was just a bunch of dogs that died, that all were contemporaries. And this is precisely the kind of thing that happens with the fossil record, that people will create all of these stories behind the bones that they find. And what's really interesting is when you see the hoaxes that have come about, and those are really, I don't want to say they're funny because it really is something that should not happen, but it can happen because you have something like the fossil record, which is so, let me not call it unscientific. We'll get to some unscientific stuff next. When you look at the fossil record, you have no evidence of one kind of organism turning into a different kind. Now, I want to point out here, that doesn't mean that it won't be found, but it's highly unlikely that it will be found if it hasn't been found yet. And one of the things that Darwin said, he pointed out on The Origin of Species, that, yeah, the fossil record isn't lining up with what I'm saying. And that's a real criticism. But his belief was that it would eventually produce the missing links that were needed. It's been 150 plus years. It hasn't happened. Probably not going to happen. And people are looking. People are wanting it to happen, but it hasn't. And our estimation here is it's not going to. All right. Chapter 6, the theory of evolution is unscientific. One thing we can point to is spontaneous generation. the other word for this is abiogenesis, that either life comes from other life, which is the law of biogenesis. This is a scientific law. This is not theory or hypothesis. Every time we see life arise, it rises from life. It does not arise from dead matter. And yet, the hypothesis of evolution needs for there to have been a time where life came from dead matter. Now, which one of those is a scientific idea? I can tell you which one we can observe, which one we have repeatedly seen happen, so much so that it is called the law of biogenesis. Abiogenesis? No one's ever seen it. And so the question becomes, which idea is more scientific? The one that says that there is a living God who produced life in this world? Or the one that says that life arose from dead matter? You tell me which one is scientific. Species transmutation does not occur. The idea here is talking about one kind or one family of organism producing a different kind. We don't see it. It doesn't happen. And so to claim that it has happened repeatedly, I mean, if everything came from a common ancestor, then what these people are saying, who are proponents of this idea, is that many, many, many times one kind of thing produced another. And I could say that's a falsifiable idea. You never see it happen, but technically it's not falsifiable, right? And the thing they need to happen. So what we can say is it has not happened. So you cannot show me evidence of it happening, because that's what you would need. And the problem here is it would need to have happened countless times over the course of the evolutionary timescale, or else none of this would have happened from an evolutionary perspective. One of my favorites is that evolution opposes the second law of thermodynamics. I talk about this quite a bit with entropy. I took thermodynamics in engineering school, and I needed to take it later on in graduate school. I had to take that. There's I should tell that story one day, but I had to take the exam for thermodynamics multiple times. And so you might say, well, based on that, you don't know anything about thermodynamics. But I would say the opposite. I had to take it. I had to take the class to make sure that on the graduate level, which I didn't do anything in graduate school related to thermodynamics, really, but it was supposed to be like an elective part of my grad school stuff. I'm in robotics, like I don't care about about that, but I can tell you a little bit about the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Specifically, the second law of thermodynamics is actually straightforward. It's the idea that things tend towards chaos, things tend toward disorder, things tend towards simple rather than complex. Evolution claims the opposite. Evolution claims that over time, things go from simple to more complex. Things go from disorderly to orderly. Things go from chaotic to organized. And they do this with no energy input. They do this with no guiding force. They just happen like that. Is that scientific? See, here's the thing. I would say it's not just unscientific. I would say it's anti-scientific, meaning it's against the scientific laws that we know of. So to claim abiogenesis, to claim one kind of organism producing another, to claim order out of chaos and complexity out of the simple with no guiding influence or force is an anti-scientific. These are anti-scientific ideas. They are not unscientific. They are not just not science. They are against science. And that's problematic, in my estimation, at least. Finally, we have fruits of evolution, and we'll go through these and get ready to finish up. Evolution destroys faith in God, the Bible, and Jesus Christ. And my interactions with some of the atheists who watch this channel has been this, that they would say evolution played a large role in them eventually renouncing Christ, losing all faith in the Bible, and eventually not even believing in God at all. Um, Evolution teaches survival of the fittest. If you truly believe that idea, this idea of might makes right, that threatens peace in the world. If you truly live in that way, in the way that I get what I want, that is not going to be something that makes for you being, well, let's say, a moral person. But again, evolution is not necessarily about being moral, of course. So if you think about, again, this subtitle of Darwin's book on the origin of species, the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Just, it's baked in, this idea that you're struggling and fighting against others for your race to survive. And of course, for him, that was the Caucasians. It leads logically to atheism. That is the case. Again, the atheism is baked in, and so they would like to tell you that no, this is just science. No, it's not, because science came from people of faith, and evolution is something that is an atheistic idea. It's part of that religion. It breaks down public morals. It gives freedom for you to do you. Um, and when a person is free to do what they please, that's not what furthers our society and from a moral perspective. It encourages racism and prejudice. I need to do a video on this. I need to do a comprehensive, deep dive into evolution, into some of the stuff that Darwin said and wrote, because I see this all the time where people try to defend it, defend Darwin, defend evolution, and tell you that no, no, it's not really racist. And you just go, I'm pretty sure it is. And so I will get to that pod eventually, where we talk about the racism of evolution, because it is. It naturally leads to racism. You if you look at Hitler's ideas, this Darwinian evolutionary perspective is in there, and you just can't really get away from it. There, a lot of the racist stuff of the 20th century, you see the evolutionary framework there. And when you look at the Bible says that God made from one man or one blood, Acts chapter 17, everybody. Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, there is no Jew nor Greek, there's no slave nor free, there's no male nor female. This idea of saying there's no Jew nor Greek or Jew or Gentile means that in Christ, the distinctions of Jewish nationality versus not are no longer there. And so the the ideas of racism and prejudice just don't make sense from a biblical worldview. They make a lot of sense from an evolutionary one. And this is why. If all humans are descended from lower forms, it stands to reason that some of us are closer to those lower forms than others. And if someone's closer to being a monkey, someone's closer to being an animal that we see as less than human, then those humans that are less human than some of us other humans can be justifiably discriminated against. And so this has been something that people, certainly in the 20th century, when there was so much killing, uh, so much genocide, if you could just simply show that those black people, that those Jewish people, that those old people are evolutionarily less fit, then just kill them. And that's what they did. But again, we'll deep dive on that at another time. Finally, I want to talk about limits on variation, because I think this is the part scientifically that I think gets as close to disproving evolution as anything. Because if you could show that there are limits on variation, limits on how much natural selection can change a kind of species, let's say, or kind of organism. I'm trying to be careful to not say species, because the idea of genus or a species are things that we came up with to try to do taxonomy for animals, but or taxonomy for organisms. But those wouldn't have necessarily been what God did. So there are limits on variation, right? There are limits on how The there's an example that's given in the pamphlet about sugar beets, I think. And what they did was they pointed out that there were these experiments done where they took beets from a certain level of sweetness to a much higher level of sweetness. Yeah, I'm gonna actually look it up right now in the pamphlet. What they were claiming was that in this in this series of experiments, there were some sugar beets, and they were able, uh, let's say in 1800, they began to push the limit of how sweet beets could be. Because I'm like sugar beets again. This is what they would have called it back in the 60s and 70s. And so there were these experiments in the 1800s where they really wanted to make these beets as sweet as possible. And so at first, they were at 6% sugar content. And they pushed the limits. They just kept trying to breed sweeter and sweeter sugar beets. And they got to this place to where they got to about 17% sugar content. And then they just couldn't push it any farther. And this is just indicative of this idea that there are limits. You can I think about something like Pinocchio, right? Where this idea that your nose can just kind of grow out to some long uh, to a length that is just defies imagination, right? I mean, if you think about that for a second, right? There are people with long noses, but there comes a point where, okay, a nose can't be any longer than a certain point. You couldn't just, okay, so if you get these two long nosed people, and you have them have children together, and you have them get married and have children together, and then you just try to push the limits of how long a person's nose can be. There's a place at which you just can't get it any longer. Is it 2 inches long? Like 2 inches out from your face? Is it 3 inches? I don't know what it is, but there's a place at which it's just not going to go any farther. There are limits on variation, and I think anybody who has any understanding of biology and science knows this. And so because of those limits on variation, that also means that when you start talking about evolution, if there are limits on variation among kinds, then that means there comes a certain point at which you just can't go any farther. But the problem with evolution is evolution says that you can go farther. You always can go farther. But our experiments, what we know from science, is that you can't. There are limits. So there's a quote from the pamphlet that, as we're bringing this to a close tonight, one great philosophy teacher states it this way: entirely too many dogmatic statements appear in too many textbooks in support of the evolution hypothesis. Propositions of proof or disproof. We object to this. Intellectual honesty is as great a virtue as any other form of honesty. Making dogmatic statements in favor of evolution just doesn't make a lot of sense, because there's no, as we've already pointed out, there is nothing to falsify it, and there isn't even really anything that experimentally you can do to try to prove it. And one of the things that I think is the closest thing to disproving it is looking at these limits on variation and pointing out that we can push it. So not even looking at natural selection, we're looking at an artificial selection here process. And when you look at those artificial selection processes, you get to a point. You can't make that apple any sweeter. You can't make that dog any smaller. You can't make that dog any bigger. Whatever the case may be, there are going to be certain limits, but it's always going to still be a dog. And that's the problem for evolution. Okay. All right. So, um, again, we just pointed out that experiments with artificial selection have repeatedly shown limits to variation. I'm going to end with a poem that comes from this book. This kind of gives you a sense of how old this book was. Again, it's like 50 plus years old. So the name of the poem is Monkey's Viewpoint. Three monkeys sat in a coconut tree, discussing things as they're said to be. Said one to the others, "Now listen, you two. There's a certain rumor that can't be true. That man descended from our noble race. Why, the very idea is a shame and disgrace. No monkey ever deserted his wife, starved her babies and ruined her life. And you've never known a mother monk to leave her babies with others to bunk, or pass them on from one to another, till they scarcely know who is their mother. And another thing you'll never see, a monk built a fence round a coconut tree, and let the coconuts go to waste, forbidding all other monks a taste. Why, if I put a fence around that tree, starvation would force you to steal from me. Here's another thing a monk won't do: go out at night and get on a stew, or use a gun or club or knife to take some other monkey's life. Yes, man descended, the ornery cuss, but brother, he didn't descend from us. So the idea here is about monkeys. We kind of began with monkeys and we ended with monkeys tonight. No, you weren't descended from a monkey, and hopefully that is something that you feel good about. Uh, we began the podcast by pointing out that Darwin said he would rather be descended from a monkey than a savage, and I would venture to say that we have some idea of what he thought a savage would be, and he'd rather be descended from a monkey than probably some of my ancestors, let's say. And so again, I don't have a problem with him articulating that. I'd rather you say it out loud. I want to know the people that talk like that. And so in the case of this, bottom line is this: that evolution is anti-scientific. That these ideas we've talked about on the podcast today are, when you think about evolution, it's anti-scientific. It's against what science says. And so whether you're looking at the laws of thermodynamics, whether you're looking at this design being ascribed to evolution when all it does is break things, or like in the case of the sickle cell anemia, giving you the favorable trait of being less likely to get malaria. These are the kinds of things that people are pointing out as evidence of evolution being a true thing. The issue is that evolution is not falsifiable, so it can't be scientific, but then it goes against clear ideas and laws in science. So evolution is anti-scientific. We've looked at that tonight. We looked at this preacher from the 60s and 70s that's able to break a lot of these things down. And he had a lot of things that are really interesting in that pamphlet. So that's it for today. Till next time, keep asking questions, keep the faith.